Hello. This movie is presented by Golden Minutes. Movie's name: Unbroken. Director: Angelina Jolie. Casts: Jack O'Connell, Miyavi, Domhnall Gleeson, Gareth Hedlund, Finn Wittrock, C.J. Walroy. Genre: war, drama. Product: 2014 USA. Movie's story: in World War II, warplanes fly over Japan. The pilot, Phil, asks Louis Zamperini to carry out his bombing mission in a suitable position. Zemp, after surveying the situation, releases the bombs and is delighted with its performance on the ground. But after that, the bomb compartment door is defective and doesn't close. Mac and Mitchell target the enemy with machine guns and Zemp goes to the bomb bay. In the meantime, Harry is injured. Zemp gives him hope to be alive and return home. Finally, with Barry's efforts, Mac and Mitchell restrain the enemy. Zemp goes to the cockpit and informs about the heavy damage of the plane which prevented the brakes from working. Therefore, they must be up to 3,000 meters high to land. Zemp remembers his childhood, when he wasn't quiet in the church and was constantly punished by his father. He remembers the words of the spiritual father that life in darkness, and love for the enemy is what makes the enemy human. He relives his childhood days. The days spent with the persecution of his Italian family, theft and drinking, and on the other hand, he has been repeatedly insulted by American racists. One day, Pete, Louis' brother, is running track and field when he sees Louis running away. He marvels at Louis' amazing speed and asks his brother to train and prepare himself for the competition. First, Louis refuses and thinks he is nothing. But Pete doesn't give up and pushes his brother towards this direction. Pete asks his coach to measure Louis' talent. Louis doesn't run as usual. To motivate Lou, Pete calls him the racist term Diego. Louis runs fast and overtakes all the participants. After that, Louis participates in various competitions and wins every time. Even in high school competition, he beat everyone and won the title of the best high school player in American history. After that, Louis qualified for the Olympics in Germany. Pete accompanies him to the train and wishes him luck. Louis also talks about his desire to qualify for the next Olympics in Tokyo. Louis returns to the present and sees the plane ready to land. Phil lands the plane on the nearest runway but has difficulty controlling it due to its high speed. After this miraculous rescue, Phil sits in a corner and prays. Then, while having a little fun, they get the command of an operation to save a group that is stuck in the ocean. So, everyone flies together with a new engineer officer, a new plane, but with many problems. In the middle of the journey, one of the engines on the left side fails. Phil asks the engineer officer for help, and meanwhile, the second engine on the left also fails. Phil announces an emergency alert and prepares to crash. Officers prepare supply boxes and lifeboats. Meanwhile, Louis goes to the Olympics in Germany. The day the Olympic torch was lit and he saw his Japanese counterpart. The next day, Louis' competition takes place. All the people of California are listening to the live report on the radio and waiting for Louis to be honored. Louis starts the race well, but falls behind most of the runners by the midway point. Then, even though the Finns are in the lead until the 8th round, Louis puts in all his efforts and leads the last round with his reserve energy in a wonderful way and takes the first place. Louis returns to the plane. The plane crashes. Louis tries to pull himself out of the water, but finds his right leg trapped by pieces of the plane. Finally, with great effort, he frees his leg and swims to the surface of the water. Then he sees Mac and Phil, the only survivors of the plane. All three go into the lifeboats. Mac takes off his underwear to cover Phil's wound. After a few moments, Mac laments the death of their friends and keeps talking about death and despair. Louis gives him hope. Then he rations their food. The next day, they see a plane flying. Mac and Louis try to get the pilot's attention by shooting flashlights and splashing paint in the water, but they don't succeed. Then Louis, who is upset about losing this opportunity, sees empty packages of provisions, which, apparently, Mac without any consideration has solved his hunger. 3 days later, while hungry and thirsty look at each other, a fish-eating chicken sits on the edge of the boat. Louis prepares to catch the bird. Then, in a quick move and with the cooperation of his friends, he succeeds. They happily open the chicken's stomach, and although they are annoyed by its contents, they try its meat. After that, it won't be long before all three of them throw up all the contents of their stomachs. At this moment, a thought comes to Louis's mind. He thinks of fishing. Phil throws a hook into the water and finally catches a relatively small fish. All three are busy eating, and it seems that this meat is more delicious than the bird. Louis tells about his mother's cooking and invites Mac and Phil to their house for lunch on the day of getting rid of this crisis. Phil tells of a Life magazine story about Eddie Rickenbacker spending 24 days in the Pacific with his friends. They survived, but most of them lost their minds. So, Louis suggests for keep talking and keep their minds alert. Then he talks about his mother's wonderful gnocchi, a type of Italian cake, how much she works for them and how delicious they are in the end. Days pass one after the other and reach the 18th day. Phil begins to pray. Louis asks him about his beliefs in God. The next day, the sea becomes stormy and the boat is tossed to and fro. Phil asks God Jesus Christ for help with all his heart. Louis also asks God for help for the first time and promises him that if his life is saved, he will dedicate his whole life to him. The sea calms down and all three people fall asleep. Louis wakes up to the drizzle and happily wakes up his friends to collect water and quench their thirst. Day 27 arrives, 3 days more than Rickenbacker's record. An airplane flies in the sky. Louis uses a flashlight. Then, in disbelief, the plane returns to the boat. It's an enemy plane and it's shooting at them. All three jump into the water. Then, when situation calmed down, they return to the boat. But they face the Japanese attack again. Louis dives in, but Mac and Phil stay in the boat and pretend to be dead. Louis returns to the boat and is happy that his friends are alive. Due to the improper targeting of the Japanese, Phil considers America the winner. Then together, they repair the holes in the boat. A few days later, Mac falls into extreme despair and weakness. He dies on the same day next to his beloved Hans. Phil and Louis, tying up the corpse, leave him in the water. Days pass one after the other and they reach the 45th day, and while there is no energy left for any of them, they sleep most of the day. Suddenly, Louis finds himself captured by a Japanese ship. Both are imprisoned in Niemer and Koch Jap prisons. However, they are more satisfied with this situation than the ocean. A few days later, the Japanese soldiers take Louis to the commander for some questions. The commander asks Louis about the U.S. forces stationed in Hawaii. Louis also declares ignorance. Then he asks about the B-24 radar and how it works. Louis also falsely says that their radars are old. Louis returns to his cell. Days passed one after the other. Louis is drawn to madness from the darkness and smallness of his cell. Then one day, the soldiers take Louis and Phil out and ask them to take off their clothes. Then, by splashing water on them, for example, they do the mission of taking bath. The next day, Louis and Phil wake up and find themselves inside a ship. Then they line up towards some trucks carrying prisoners. Phil and Louis get separated during the ride and don't see each other until the end of the war. Louis is transferred to the Amori camp. Old and new prisoners line up. Corporal Watanabe introduces himself. During Watanabe's speech, all the prisoners stare at the floor, but Louis, as usual, stares at him. Watanabe gets angry at Louis's look and goes towards him. He severely wounds Louis with a few blows of his wand for his gaze. After that, the new arrivals stay in quarantine so as not to transfer possible contamination to the sanatorium. They enter the sanatorium at night, and with the guidance of Tom Miller, the commander of the sanatorium, will settle in place. The old captives call Watanabe by the name Bird. Then they consider his brutality as a result of his mental complexes. Louis meets Fittner Gerald, who lost all his fingernails in confession. Months pass and the winter snow covers the camp white. On a snowy day, Watanabe discovers the talents of the camp: Frank Tinker, an opera singer, a chef from Sydney, and an Olympic athlete. Louis inevitably introduces himself. Watanabe asks him to compete with a Japanese officer. Louis fails for his greatly weakened. Watanabe humiliates Louis by using the phrase, "You're nothing." Then, with his chopsticks, he beats Louis's face. Sometime later, the old prisoners get busy with finding war plans. Working together, they steal the maps, and by analyzing them, they realize the advance of the American forces to the Marshall Islands. The next day, a number of forces collect feces and transfer it to the sea. Suspecting the captives, Watanabe raids the asylum at night and finally finds the plans. He severely punishes Jimmy for this act. Then he takes some of the captives out of the asylum for punishment. Louis, who is affected by the punishment of his comrades, decides to kill Watanabe. But Fittner Gerald asks him to keep calm and help win this war just by staying alive. Sometime later, Louis is taken to Watanabe's office. Then they introduce him to two people from Radio Tokyo and give him the permission to tell his family and people of America that he is alive and healthy through the radio. However, they think he is dead. The promised day arrives and Louis prepares to speak on the radio. He addresses his family members after 2 years away and talks about his health and the very good conditions of the camp. Then he ends his message by wishing him a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. After that, Louis eats at a luxury restaurant. During lunch, the radio employees return and deliver the script for Louis's next performance. A text that contains false statements about America, and Louis refuses. By disobeying the execution, Louis is brought back to Emory. Watanabe welcomes him. At first, he calls Louis a strong man like himself, who deserves friendship. Then, because of his disobedience, he puts him in the same category as enemies. After that, to punish Louis, Watanabe asks all the prisoners to line up and teach him respect and courtesy by punching Louis in the face. Fittner refuses to obey the order. At the same time, Watanabe orders Jimmy to be brought. He beats Jimmy for disobeying Gerald. Louis asks Fittner to pull the punch and save Jimmy. The fights continue, and finally, with the sunset, the captives are finished and Louis falls to the ground unconscious. A long time later, several of the prisoners, in cooperation with each other, organize a show to improve the mood of their fellow soldiers. In the middle of the show, Watanabe sits next to Louis and tells him a good news, promotion, and of course he has bad news as well: he will leave the camp tomorrow. Without congratulating Watanabe, Louis is counting the minutes for Watanabe to leave. The next day, Watanabe leaves Emory. The captives are happy that Watanabe went and they are playing and having fun. Finally, the Allies reach Tokyo. They attack even on the camp and all the captives line up to put out the fire. Despite the happiness of most of the prisoners, one of them doesn't seem happy and satisfied with the advance of the Allies. Because he believes that with the victory of this group, the Japanese will kill all the prisoners. The next day, the Japanese take all the prisoners from the camp. In order to avoid the Allies, they bring the prisoners to the Natsu camp after a long journey by rail. The prisoners enter Natsu and line up in a corner. Louis's legs get limp from seeing of Corporal Watanabe. Watanabe introduces himself as usual. Then he criticizes Louis for not looking and beats him up. After that, each of the new prisoners is settled in a dirty place with no facilities. The next day and the following days, they serve the Japanese in moving coals. One day, Louis, who has become extremely weak and fragile, stops working for a short time. The Japanese officer takes Louis to Watanabe for punishment. Watanabe orders Louis to pick up one of the timbers and hold it over his head, and if he drops it, he will be targeted by the Japanese officer. All the prisoners and even the Japanese officers stop working and stare at Louis. After shaking and enduring for a while, Louis manages to lift the timber. Watanabe, who considers himself defeated by Louis' spiritual power, attacks him with his wand. Louis passes out from the pain and falls asleep in the same spot all night. The next day, the Japanese officer announces new news. Gerald translates his words: "The war has come to an end and we invite the captives to bathe in the Hokura River." Frank is saddened by this and assumes they are dead. Then all the captives enter the river and prepare to be massacred. But suddenly, they see an American plane that has identified the camp. American forces throw food and supplies to the prisoners. A few hours after the truce, Louis goes to Watanabe's office to see him. But he only sees a wand and picture of him with his father. Finally, after years of waiting, the captives return to their families. Louis also returns to America and hugs his family members. He married his lover Cynthia Applewhite in 1946. Light Russell Phil Phillips also marries his lover, Sissy. He and Louis have been friends for many years. Matsuhiro Watanabe, aka the Bird, remains in hiding as a war criminal for several years, until he is pardoned by American efforts to make peace with Japan. Louis also fulfills his promise to God and devotes his life to him. He realizes that in life, you have to forgive. So he returns to Japan and meets his captors. Of course, the Bird refuses to meet. Years later, Louis achieves his dream of running in the Olympics in Japan. At the age of 80, he runs and smiles in front of the people of Tokyo with a torch in his hand.